Welcome to Mind the Business Radio, the radio show that helps you grow your business. And now, here's Suzanne, Darwin, and Ernie. All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Mind the Business Radio. I'm Darwin.
I'm Ernie.
And I'm Suzanne. Thank you for listening.
And before we get started, I just want to let everybody know that they can reach us on www.mtbradio.net. And you can go there and listen to all of our shows and get some cool information. And you can even join the M.T.B family. We'd love to have you listening to the show. And we got some great new and exciting things coming up next year. So hang on for that. Today, our guest, all the way from Australia, is Mike Adams. Whereabouts in Australia are you?
I'm sitting in the dark in Melbourne because we have different time zones around the planet. So.
All right.
No.
Okay.
All the way from Melbourne, Australia, Mike Adams. Ernie, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about
please.
Mike?
Okay. Mike Adams is an engineer turned salesperson. He taught himself storytelling on the job while selling and managing sales teams in the United Kingdom, Russia, India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia for international corporations, Schlumberger, Siemens, Nokia, and Halliburton. Since 2014, Mike has been helping companies find and develop their own stories through his storytelling consulting practice. Mike is married with 3 sons and lives in Melbourne, Australia. And, you know, he's also the author of the book, which we are going to talk about. It's called 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. So, Mike...
You're busy.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, why must salespeople tell the 7 stories, and what exactly are they?
Yeah. Well, why must salespeople tell stories? The short answer is stories are the natural language of humans. We learn and inspire ourselves, motivate ourselves by stories. We tell ourselves stories all the time. But in business, people think storytelling is unbusinesslike. But of course, we're still humans in business, so it has to be businesslike because that's the way we communicate. The 7 stories that the salespeople must tell are the stories that really solve 3 problems that salespeople have. The first problem is, how do I connect with a potential buyer? How do I connect with a future customer? And there are 3 stories that do that. The first is your personal story. So personal story, I'll tell mine in a minute. Your listeners will know who I am. But the personal story is a story that explains who you are, why you do what you do, and why should I trust you and why should I respect you as an authority to buy from. And then there's your company story, which is critically important. Most salespeople can't tell the narrative of their company, why their company exists and how it came to exist. And then there's the story of what I call the key staff, the other people in your organization that your future client or future customer needs to know about. They need to trust that person as well. So can you tell the story of your CEO or your technical expert or your head of customer service? Can you tell the story of that person so that you prime your future customer to trust them? So those are the 3 stories that connect you to a future client. But it's not good enough to have a connection. You need to change your future client. You need to change them to accept the ideas that you have about how they should do their business, because that's what selling is. It's about changing people to do something else. The 2 stories that do that are insight stories. So that's a story that teaches your client how you know something about their business that they don't quite appreciate. They need to understand this thing, and we need to teach them, and stories are much better than telling them some facts that they'll probably just push back on. And then there's the story that probably most people have a little bit of an idea about. I call it a success story. It's the story of someone else like this future client that succeeded with your company. And if you can tell the story about how they did that and make that other person, that successful client, the hero of that story, then it's extremely compelling. It's almost like test driving your products and services. Your future client can live the experience of your other client and learn about your products and services.
Okay.
And then but you're still not finished as a salesperson because you still need to get the contract signed.
Yeah, right.
And that's
That's important.
that's where the last two stories come in.
Okay.
And these are stories that help your future customer feel comfortable that you're the right company to do business with. So the first one is a values story, which is a story about how your company behaves in its corporate values once they are a customer.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a teaching story, which I would also call like the sales manager's story. And that's the story that teaches your future client how to make this big decision, how to make this important decision, and how to get the rest of their company on board to all of the people that are needed to make a decision. So those are the 7 stories. So personal story, company story, key staff story, they help you connect. And then insight story, success story, they help you change and differentiate your company. And then value stories and teaching stories help get the deal, help get the contract signed. So quick intro, but
Yeah.
I should probably just say what a story is and what it isn't, because there's a lot of confusion.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you were talking about storytelling 10 years ago, no one wanted to hear because it just sounded unbusinesslike. And now we have the situation where everyone likes to use the word story, but they use it in a not very tight meaning. And if you don't know what it means exactly, then you run the risk of thinking you're telling a story and you're not. And so far, I haven't told a single story, and we need to change that in a second. So a story, by definition, is a sequence of related events. If it's not a sequence of related events, it isn't a story.
Okay.
Now, that's the first number one definition. So when you go on a company's website and they say our story, and they tell you we started in 1985, good, that's an event. And then they say, and we're the biggest company in the United States, that's not an event, that's a claim. And we have 10,000 staff, that's another claim. That they think that's a story, but that's not a story. It has to be a sequence of related events, and the events have to connect to each other.
Oh.
So otherwise it's not a story. And this is really important to understand, because mentally we have a problem with our brains if we don't connect the events in a sequence, because the biggest part of our brain, the neocortex, is actually a memory sequence organ. It's an organ that looks for sequences that repeat, and then it tries to predict what's going to happen next. And your brain was predicting I was going to say the word next. And that's what your brain does all the time for everything, is predict what's going to happen next. And what a beautiful thing about stories is that they are not only a sequence of events, but by convention, they're unpredictable. So good stories are unpredictable. So our brain pays attention when it can't quite predict what's going to happen next.
Right.
And so stories are natural attention gainers. We listen to stories because we want to know what's going to happen next in the story. So I didn't always know that. In fact, I've only known that fairly recently, and I'll tell a little story now about me, about how I got into storytelling. So I grew up in Tasmania, which is a small island to the south.
Tasmania, okay.
Yeah, that's me. I almost always get asked about Tasmanian devils.
Yes, I was going to ask you that, but I thought you've already been asked that. So
They're cute.
They don't spin around, but they're real animals.
Okay.
So I grew up there, and I studied to be an engineer. I did electrical and mechanical engineering.
Okay.
And I got this kind of dream job out of university, which was to go and work and live all over the world in the oil industry. And I actually started working on oil rigs, running electronic instruments in oil wells. And I moved on to work in our computing center in London. I was working for Schlumberger as a very big $30 billion oil and gas services company. And I was actually, this is mid-90s, I was getting involved in a very brand new piece of software called a neural network, an artificial neural network, which at the time had a lot of hype. These days it has a huge amount of hype because it works now, but it didn't work in 1995. And I was using it to try and classify rocks. And I got this request to talk to my boss. He called me in and he said, "Mike, we have this fantastic career opportunity, which is corporate code for a job no one else wants." If you don't know,
it's
if you haven't
true
worked
though.
Career opportunity means job no one wants. He said, "Well, we want you to go to Norway," and I'm like, "Oh, that sounds pretty good," and be a salesperson. And I'm like, "No, I don't want to be a salesperson." But what I actually said was I can't go because my wife is 8 months pregnant. And I went home that night and she said, no, I really want to go to Norway.
Oh,
Good for her.
Yeah, exactly.
a little
So we went to
adventure,
Norway.
right?
Yes, we're both pretty adventurous. And so we went to Norway. I was learning how to be a salesperson on a very early Motorola mobile phone, and she was giving birth in a public hospital
gosh.
because there's no private healthcare in Norway. And it was actually quite tough, but I was a very green salesperson. But I had this incredible stroke of good fortune, and it took me about 10 years to realize how lucky I was. But I just happened to meet exactly the right person in a big oil company who decided they liked our software and he needed it for himself. But he didn't want to just buy it for himself. He wanted his entire corporation, one of the big 5 oil companies in the world. He wanted his entire corporation to have this software. So he personally decided to sell it for us. And there was a big conference in Stavanger in Norway, and he got up on stage and presented our software to about 30 people who'd flown in from all over the world. And I won the first big corporate deal for our software.
Oh,
Good for
wow.
you.
Good for you, yeah.
Total accident. Yeah, so, and I'm pretty sure I would have gone back to engineering if that hadn't happened. But it's very human nature. You do that by luck and you think you're good, so you stay doing it, right? And I wasn't good. But I was working for a company that offered really good training, and I ended up becoming a sales manager. We moved to Russia.
Oh,
I had 3 boys by that stage. We lived in Moscow, and then after quite a long time with Schlumberger, I decided to quit and come back and live in Australia. And there's no oil and gas industry in Melbourne, so I needed to change industry. And really, the transferable skill I had by that stage was sales, and I talked my way. I told a good story. In fact, I remember the story, to get a job selling telecommunications network equipment to the biggest telco company in Australia for Siemens, which is a huge German multinational company. And I used to joke that I was perfect for that job, apart from not knowing anything about Siemens or my client or telecommunications equipment. But I'm an engineer, so the technical side wasn't a problem. But learning how to sell for a completely different company was really quite challenging, and that was really where I started to work on the stories. I had started to kind of think, like, if you don't know anything about your company, you don't know its technology, you don't know your client, you don't know anything about the market, what do you need to learn first, and how quickly can you learn it? And this is where I discovered that I needed those stories, and I was sort of naturally seeking out the different people that I needed to hear the stories from. And you would get a lot of facts. You would get 100 slide PowerPoint pack, right, of all the facts, but it didn't tell me the stories I wanted to understand. And that's, I'll tell you a story from my time at Siemens. So I've just told my personal story, so that's story number 1. I've told you a story about how I got into and how I changed industry. But I'll tell you what.
We have to take a quick break.
I knew that was coming.
And we'll come back and we'll do your story from Siemens. Really interested in hearing that, but we're going to take a quick break right now. Everybody, you're listening to Mind the Business Radio. I'm Darwin.
I'm Ernie.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we'll be back right after this.
Looking for a great gift? Want to personalize your phone or electronic device? Or simply want to decorate your home? Jaybird Designs is a photographic design company offering beautiful images that can be printed on almost anything. Take a look at www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs. That's www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this edition of Mind the Business. I'm Ernie.
I'm Darwin.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we're talking to Mike Adams, who's the author of a book called 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. And before, in the previous segment, he was telling us our story, and you were starting to tell us about your Siemens story.
Yes. Well, one of the things when you change industry, and this is my first industry change, I changed industry 5 times in the end, but this is the first time I'd sort of been trying to solve this problem of how do I represent a company that I don't really know. And Schlumberger is a technical company, and so is Siemens, so you kind of assume they're the same. But I realized that they're quite different companies.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't quite work out how Siemens really sold anything, because it didn't seem like we had the very best product, and our marketing wasn't very good, and the sales organization was very technical, really an engineering company, not a sales company at all.
Oh wow.
but then I started hearing certain type of story, and I'll give you an example. I was actually in the office of our Australia CEO, and he came off the telephone and he took the call while I was there, and it was obviously a serious call, and put the phone down, and he explained to me that Siemens was delivering the main components for an electricity cable that was connecting Tasmania, where I'm from, to the mainland Australia. So it goes 400 kilometers under the ocean. And the ship that was bringing the transformers, the big electrical transformers from Germany to Australia, hit a storm in the Southern Ocean and broke its rudder, and all 6 transformers were smashed beyond repair.
No.
And so this is like a multi-year, huge public infrastructure project that was now seriously at risk.
Oh, wow.
And he'd been on the phone, and he was on the television that night as well, explaining what was going on. And he told me that the Siemens board were not talking about who they were going to litigate and all this kind of thing. They just, how quickly can we remake 6 transformers? And they built those transformers in record time, in way under the normal lead time, and got them delivered such that the project hit its original planned opening commissioning date.
So they just went in and solved the problem.
They went in and built new equipment.
Okay.
Yeah. And this sort of story, we call that a value story. This is story number 6 actually, but this is when you're selling big ticket items, that kind of story is incredibly persuasive. Because people's jobs are at stake. In this case, huge project is at stake, and I realized that there were stories being told in this company that I needed to learn, and there are many stories like that with this kind of company, big, huge engineering projects that just have to work. So yeah, and I changed career for. When I joined Siemens, we merged and we became Nokia Siemens, and I went back overseas and I went to live in Malaysia. Our boys were a bit older by then, with 3 boys. And because I went to live in KL, and KL is an oil and gas town, I went back into the oil and gas business for reasons to do with corporate stupidity, actually. We were doing this massive merger that took 3 years, and it wasn't very much fun.
Oh, no.
And so I went back in the oil and gas industry, changed company again, but that was sort of a comfortable change. But then when I came back to Australia, I went and worked in the facility services business, which is selling cleaning and cooking and catering services.
Wow, you've been all over.
Yeah, but that sort of sounds mundane and not technical. I was selling software and technology before that. But we're selling these contracts by the 10, 20, 30, upwards $1 million, big contracts for the mining villages and townships in the far west of Australia. And so I had to change industry again. But by that time, I'd kind of figured out what stories I was looking for. And I did that 2 more times. And then eventually I decided that I wanted to see if I could help the salespeople I'd work with. I'd become sales manager. I was working with big sales teams. I had more than 100 salespeople working for me at different times. And I was fascinated by the problem that salespeople very often say the wrong thing. And if people ask me what I do, my 1-sentence answer is I help salespeople say the right thing.
Okay.
And the right thing that's a really challenging job, actually, to help say the right thing. But that right thing is very often a story, because salespeople, by reputation, let's say 80, 90% of us, and I include myself, right? I make all these same mistakes myself. I think we all do. We're so close to our product, and we want to talk about our product, but we forget to make a human connection first. Because no one wants to hear about our product, and then no one wants to answer our questions. Almost all sales training is about asking the right question, but but no one answers your question in any kind of open way until they trust you. So if you don't make that authentic connection first, you're just sounding like a salesperson that's asking these questions that no one wants to answer. And so learning how to start by telling a short story. I mean, I've been rambling a bit because you told me you've got a bit of time, but you need to be able to tell a personal story in a couple of minutes. And the reason you want to tell that story right at the beginning is you want to be able to ask this question. And the question is, well, enough about me. What about you? Why do you do what you do? Because you've offered something in a short personal story. If I've told someone that my wife was 8 months pregnant when we went to Norway, that's personal, and you'll probably get something personal back as well. And this is the real key to storytelling. We're not telling stories just to be interesting, and we're telling stories to exchange stories. We want to hear the other person's story. So if I tell a story about me personally, that's extremely effective in a first one-to-one meeting, because they'll tell me their story and we start to know each other. And they'll start to trust me and start to know, okay, this guy seems to know something. And if I tell a story about my company and I tell it in the right way, they start to know about my company. And then I can say, well, what about your company or your division? How did you guys get going? What do you do? And I start to hear a narrative of their company. So that's the first really important point of storytelling, is we tell stories so that we can get another story, so we can get one back.
Get one back.
So is that the first story you tell is your personal story?
Not necessarily. Okay. It's the first story I tell in a serious first meeting, face to face.
Okay.
But I can't tell my personal story if I need to cold connect with someone, because no one has time to hear your personal story if you're interrupting their day with a phone call, for example, or if you're sending a first email to connect, or a LinkedIn message, or whatever it is. So we tend to use half a story to make that little curious introduction. And one of the fascinating things about stories is that we hate half a story. We always, if you go to be continued, we have to know the rest. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if I start to tell you an insight story or a success story about a client that's succeeded, but I don't finish it, that's a beautiful way to make that connection. Like, could we meet? And I'll tell you the story. I'll finish that story. So we tend to use half an insight story or a success story to make that connection. But let me explain what those two stories are, because I think they are the heart of selling, the two stories that help you change your future client's mind.
Okay, we have to. I hate to do this. We have to take another break.
Oh,
good.
Okay. No problem. All right. Oh, perfect. I like people when they say that. We have to take good. I love breaks.
Okay.
All right, everybody. You're listening to Mind to Business Radio, and I'm Darwin.
I'm Ernie.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we're going to be right back with more stories right after this.
Looking for a great gift? Want to personalize your phone or electronic device? Or simply want to decorate your home? Jaybird Designs is a photographic design company offering beautiful images that can be printed on almost anything. Take a look at www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs. That's www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs.
Welcome back, everybody, to this edition of Mind the Business. I'm Suzanne.
I'm Darwin.
And I'm Ernie.
And today we're talking to Mike Adams, all the way from Melbourne, Australia. His book is called 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. And we've been talking about stories. And before I ask Mike my next question, I'd like to say hello to our dear listeners in Canada. Thank you so much for listening to us. And we're going to tell you more stories. Mike, when I first meet someone and I want to sell them something, or I just want to introduce myself, what kind of a story do I have to tell? What is it called?
Well, the first story, it depends. The answer is it depends. There are 2 stories, and you need to choose which one. If you're an entrepreneurial company and you don't have successful clients like the person you're trying to connect with, then you can't tell a success story. That's my definition of an entrepreneurial company. You don't have a success story yet.
Okay.
So the only choice you have is an insight story. So you've built your company because you believe you have some insight that the market needs to know about. So you need to tell the story of that insight. And that's a challenge because by definition, insights are different and challenging and new, and people don't necessarily accept what you say. And I'll tell you an insight story, which is a pretty classic example, and I think you'll get the point. So back in the early 80s in Western Australia, in Perth, two medical researchers, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, were working on the problem of stomach ulcers. And they had a hypothesis that stomach ulcers were caused by a particular bacteria. It's called H. pylori. And at the time, the medical establishment view was that stomach ulcers are caused by stress. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was thought that bacteria could not survive in the highly acidic environment of the stomach. And Marshall and Warren couldn't get their papers published. In fact, no one wanted to hear their story at all. So they had an idea, they had a challenging insight, but no one wanted to listen. And in frustration, Barry Marshall gave himself an endoscopy of his own stomach, prepared a potion of this particular bacteria from an infected patient, and drank it and gave himself stomach ulcers.
Oh, no.
And then treated himself with antibacteria for H. pylori.
Wow,
that's amazing.
That paper got attention. And Marshall and Warren won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2004.
Wow.
Good for them.
So they started in 85, and it took them 9 years.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's an insight story, a pretty good one.
Yeah.
But it shows the problem. The problem of insight is you have this burning knowledge, you have this idea. That's the typical entrepreneur, right? The super enthusiastic person with the new idea. But no one wants to know, because everyone thinks they know what they're doing and they know their business, and you coming in and challenging it. And what a lot of sales textbooks will tell you is, you need to confront your client with this new idea, but that doesn't work so well, particularly if you're a young 20-something entrepreneur.
Yes.
But if you can tell the story, about how you discovered that idea, or I call it the researcher's story, that's compelling. And what you're doing when you tell that story, the insight story, is you're taking your future customer on a mental journey from where they are, which is where you were before you discovered this thing, and you teach them how you discovered it, including the ups and downs, like Marshall and Warren's challenge. They couldn't get their story accepted. So how did you get it accepted? And you tell that story. And when you do it that way, people just stop and listen, because that's what we do with stories. We just stop and listen, we pay attention, we don't push back, and we learn. It's how we learn, actually, through stories. So the insight story is also the entrepreneur story. It's a critically important story for entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs often fail because they don't realize that without the story, they are not very engaging. They're not very compelling. They invite pushback.
Okay.
So that's the first story for, let's say, a reach out connection. Before I've got the first meeting and I can tell my personal story. But let's say you've been in business a while. Probably most of your listeners have. You've got lots of customers. And you probably have lots of success stories, but most businesses don't craft these stories the right way. And in fact, the common term that we use in business is not success story. The common term is case study. And I would like to highlight the difference between the classic case study and a true success story. So case studies are usually written by marketing departments, and this is not to denigrate marketing departments. I'm a kind of marketing person myself. I fit between marketing and sales.
Okay.
But marketing departments, when they take a client success story, they usually extract all the good stuff and throw it away, because they're worried about getting permission to put it on their website.
Right.
And they think that they have to pump up their company in the case study, and actually they don't. So what they do is they anonymize the story to remove who the client really was, and then they make it sort of three parts, and they say, this is the client situation, here's us, we came in, here's what we did, and here's how fantastic it is now. and aren't we fantastic is the subtext. But that's not what your future client wants to hear. So let me tell you a success story. It's actually in 6 parts. I'll tell the story. It's a very self-serving one for my business.
Okay.
I'll tell that story, and then I'll come back and I'll break up the parts, and you'll hear how it's different from a case study. So my success story is about David Massover. David Massover was a sales manager in Silicon Valley, worked in several startup companies there, very successful, and got interested in the sales process, and he actually wrote 2 books on sales process that were quite successful. And but then through family situation, he decided to move to Europe and live in Budapest, and that presented him a little bit of a challenge because he doesn't speak the language, and he couldn't really easily work with sales teams there, so he needed to change his business, and he decided to instead of coaching sales teams, to coach individual salespeople and reach out to individual salespeople on LinkedIn. So he considered the entire planet his market, so salespeople on LinkedIn. But he didn't find that so easy to get started doing that. And at about this time, I connected with David on LinkedIn. I just noticed a couple of his articles and commented on them. And I, through a LinkedIn message, told him I'd written a book on storytelling, and he said he'd love to read it because he writes books. And about a week after I sent him the manuscript, this is before I published the book, I got this very, very excited email from David saying, Mike, this book is so fabulous. And not only that, I've taken my personal story and an insight story, merged them together, and I've been using them in my reach out to salespeople, and it's just instantly made all the difference. And now I have a full book of business, and I privately admit I was struggling a little bit. And I said, great, that's fantastic. Can I hear your personal story? And he told it to me, and it wasn't bad, but it was not technically quite correct. So we did a video conference for about an hour, and we talked through his stories, and he's just going fantastically well. He's got that business up and running. In fact, he's looking at how he expands it now.
Good.
So that's a success story, and I want to break it down because this really important sequence of that story. Okay. So you might have noticed I started telling you about David.
Yes.
I told you that he was in Silicon Valley and he was a successful guy and he'd written books and all of that. I didn't start telling you about me or my company. And that's the first mistake that salespeople and companies make. They start talking about themselves.
I see. Okay.
So I start talking about that successful client I would tell David's story when I was trying to sell someone on using my book or my book, because I'm using that story to sell my book, right? But so I tell you about David, and then I tell you about the problem David has. So his problem is he needs to pivot his business, and he needs to go into a completely new business that he's not sure how to do that. Even though he's a very experienced guy, he knows how to sell, but anyone who needs to start a new business has a big problem. And David met a guide, and that guide was me in the form of my book. So that's the third step. So your client, tell me about your client, tell me about their situation before they have the problem. Okay. Tell me about their problem. That's the second step. Now tell me about meeting the guide. How did they meet your company? That's step 3. Now the guide provides a plan. You might be noticing by now that this is actually the plot of a movie as well, Star Wars or Karate Kid or almost any Hollywood movie. So you meet the master. The master gives you a plan, and then you avoid failure. It's important to mention how things could go wrong. I told you that I needed to help coach David in some technical aspects of the story, but I also told you that it wasn't going that well for him, that he really did have a problem, and if he didn't solve this problem the right way, that probably he wasn't going to be able to make that business work in Budapest. So we're avoiding failure is the 5th part of the success story. How do you avoid failure? And the final part is the success. Where is he at now? What's happened right now? So there's actually 6 parts to a success story, and if you craft them in that way, your future customer will be totally engaged, because You're giving them an experience. That's what stories do. Stories allow us to experience something that we don't have to go and personally experience. We just experience it through the story.
Exactly.
And so your future client can experience what it's like to work with you, to buy your products and services and succeed.
Okay.
And that's a very powerful story. And salespeople and marketing people need to think about constructing it that way, not in 3 parts, because it's much more compelling.
Okay. You know what? We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to get back to talking about success stories and stuff with Mike Adams. But right now, we're going to, like I said, take a quick break. Ernie, why don't you tell everybody how they can get a hold of us? And
Yes, well, they can listen to this show and previous ones on our website, which is www.mtbradio.net.
Good.
Or they can go to our old URL, which is mindthebusinessradio.com, and it'll go to our page. They can listen to us on iHeart, on Spotify, iTunes,
TuneIn,
and then other audio apps out there.
You bet. Anyway, everyone, you're listening to Mind the Business Radio, and we're going to take a quick break and be right back right after this.
Looking for a great gift? Want to personalize your phone or electronic device? Or simply want to decorate your home? Jaybird Designs is a photographic design company offering beautiful images that can be printed on almost anything. Take a look at www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs. That's www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Mind the Business. We took a quick break, and we're talking now with Mike Adams. And one of the things I want to ask you, Mike, is what about the company story? I mean, we talked about the personal story, but even the company is personal because it's filled with all kinds of people. So I know all these stories. Do they conjure together and make one story for the company? Is that how that works, or what happens there?
Well, not quite. The company story is the narrative about really why and how does your company exist is the company story. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the connection stories, and I skipped over it for your listeners. I'll tell you the story about how I first appreciated why and how company stories work. I was working in Russia for Schlumberger in my first company that I worked for, and I heard the story about Schlumberger in Russia. Now, Schlumberger is an old company. It started in the late 1920s. The Schlumberger brothers are French, and they invented a technique for putting an electrode down an oil well and measuring the resistivity. And what you're actually measuring is the resistivity of the fluid in the rock. Oil has a high resistivity, and water, which is normally what's in a hole when you drill it in the ground, has a low resistivity. So they actually invented an oil indicator. They could tell whether their client, the oil company, had actually drilled an oil well or not, which is pretty useful information. And that's made a $30 billion company, that invention.
Wow.
But when they invented it, they had a huge insight, but they couldn't get it accepted. But the first place in the world that really did accept that idea was the Soviet Union. And they moved in and worked all through the Soviet Union with their equipment, and that was their first success. And then they had a huge, massive problem. They were nationalized by Stalin, so they had all their equipment stolen essentially by the state, and they were kicked out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union, and that was in the 1930s. But fortunately, by that time, their technique had been started to be used in Texas, in the US, and they worked all over the world, but never in the Soviet Union.
Okay.
And then in the late mid-90s, when the Soviet Union was opening up for Western companies again, they had to make a decision: do we go back into Russia or not? Because obviously that hadn't been a very pleasant experience. In fact, there were some aspects of that experience that were extremely dark that I won't go into. And so the strategy guys took a business case to the CEO, and they basically asked him one question: how much money are you willing to risk on a market entry back into Russia? And he said $200 million with no hesitation. And so they decided to sponsor two of the newly privatized Russian oil companies. They put in a CFO and technical people and technology. And within the space of 18 months, they doubled the production of of those two companies. And they were the only two companies that doubled their production in that time. Everyone else was going down. It was a really tough time for business in Russia. And they did fabulously well in Russia. That's a multi-billion-dollar business for Schlumberger, just Russia now. So anyway, I told that story to my clients. I told the story about the company being nationalized and deciding to come back in, which is a version of a company story. And I knew that story was doing work for me because I started hearing that story back from my clients and from other clients, which means they were telling that story to themselves. They were telling that story, and it was going around. And this is the thing about stories. It's not just I tell you a story. The person who hears a good story tells it again and again and again, and your story goes around, right? So if you have a compelling narrative, and that's a pretty compelling one, it does work for you when you're not there. It just moves, it travels. And the elements of that story are what you need in a company story. I told you about the birth of the company and how it started, the invention that started the company. I told you about some struggles the company came. This is really important thing about stories. Stories are generally not heroic in this. We don't try to make our stories sound like we're fantastic, talented geniuses. When we put vulnerability and failure into our stories, it becomes much more relatable and true. You know, that story is true, right? But the subtext of that story is that, you know, Schlumberger will make you rich. This is a company with technology that will make you rich, right? But they struggled like every other company to get their idea understood and to get their business accepted in the marketplace. So I bagged marketing people for not understanding success stories, but they do a much worse job in general with company stories than they do with success stories because most people do not tell the narrative, the sequence of events of their company. They want to tell you the facts. And those facts all sound the same. All of your competitors sound exactly the same to your buyers because you all choose the same facts and you all try to say you're number one at this or that or the other, and you're in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, and it doesn't even get heard. Those opinions and facts are just noise, but the narrative is fascinating. So you have to find the narrative of your company and tell that, not the facts and the opinions.
It's amazing that how stories are so effective. Like you were telling us about just people just giving you facts, and you're right, facts are noise, but stories, if you're actually telling a story which has a beginning and a middle and an end, people will hang on to that.
Oh, I want that happy ending if I can.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly right.
So Mike, what story do you tell to close the sale?
Yeah, well, I told you the story about Siemens and the cable, the smashed transformers, the shipbroker's rubber. Well, that's one of the stories that will definitely help you close the deal because what happens with particularly bigger deals, and in fact not that big a deal, maybe a deal worth more than $10,000, $20,000 even, is that the decision is not made by one person. There's a little buying group. Maybe the CFO is there. There's 3 or 4 people, and you, the salesperson, you're not there. And they're making a decision. Are we going to spend this money? Are we going to buy from company A, B, or C? Or are we going to go and spend our money on something else, right? And at some point, someone's going to say, look, can we really trust that company? And if your sponsor, the person who wants to buy from your company, if they've heard a value story like that Siemens story I told you, they will be very persuasive on, no, this is the right company to buy from. So that's one of the stories that helps close the deal. The other one is the story that teaches your client how to close the deal. I'll give you an example. When I was working in the telecommunications industry, I was actually working on one of the very early music download platforms. Before there was an iPod, so this tells you how old I am. This is sort of mid 2000s. So I was working. We were selling to a media company, a very big media company, and we'd been working on this deal for months. And I had flown people from all over the world for our company. There were probably about 20 people from our company in Australia, and about the same number from the client company. And we were working initially on how to actually make the technology work, but we were also working on a business model, and it was going to be a revenue share. So we were going to get a certain number of cents for every song that was downloaded.
Okay.
And it got to the point where we had to sign the contract, and I had to go in with my team to the headquarters, and we got up into this big meeting room, great big long table, all of our people sitting down one side, about 10 of us, and their people 10 on the other side. And then at the head of the table, this new guy came in that I hadn't met before, and he was the chief negotiator. And this guy was an animal. He got the contract and just sort of pulled it apart. You know, this is not good enough quality, the price, no way. And our collaborative sort of deal that we'd put together was just getting torn to pieces. And I remember walking back to my office, which was a short walk from their company headquarters, feeling like, man, we're just not going to get this deal closed. And one of my colleagues, an older, more experienced sales guy, looked at me, and he saw the look on my face, and he said, you know, what's wrong? And I said, no, we're not going to close that deal. That's impossible. And I told him a couple of things that had happened. And he said, Mike, why don't you just ring that guy up, the negotiator, and then go and have a chat with him? And I hadn't even thought of the possibility. It's like, really? Yeah, of course, you know. So I rang him up, and I spent 2 hours with a guy up in the corporate headquarters, and I realized that he didn't have a clue about how this contract was structured and what would work and what wouldn't work. And he was one of the sort of blustery negotiators. And he had a job, and his job was to get the price down, but he didn't know what he was negotiating. And it was really interesting. We went back in a week later, and it was the same setup, the big table. And he was exactly the same character. He was the same very tough, very ruthless, very hard guy who skirted around every non-negotiable issue that I'd explained to him. And we got the deal done.
Good.
Wow.
And that's a teaching story.
That's
right?
a success story.
That's a sales manager's teaching story. And I've used that story. I've taught my salespeople with that story that you need to help people save face.
Yes.
And you need to work behind the scenes on these deals to get everyone comfortable with what's going on. And so that's an example. That's actually the 7th story about how to get the deal closed.
Wow.
A little extra TLC, yes.
Yep, that's what it takes. We're going to take a quick break and come back. And you're listening to Mind the Business Radio. I'm Darwin.
I'm Ernie.
And I'm Suzanne.
And we'll be right back right after this.
Looking for a great gift? Want to personalize your phone or electronic device? Or simply want to decorate your home? Jaybird Designs is a photographic design company offering beautiful images that can be printed on almost anything. Take a look at www.zazzle.com/jaybird-designs. That's www.zazzle.com/Jaybird Designs.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mind the Business, and I'm Ernie.
I'm Darwin.
And I'm
I almost
Suzanne.
forgot.
Hey, who are you?
Who am I? Yeah, exactly.
And we've been talking to Mike Adams, who is the author of a book called 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. And so, Mike, could you tell us about the book?
Right. So the book is available anywhere on the planet on Amazon and a number of other book outlets, online as an ebook, as a hardback and a softback, and there'll be an audio book coming out in a week or so. Mike Bosworth, one of the famous authors in B2B selling, very kindly wrote the foreword for 7 Stories. That's one of the unexpected benefits of writing a book, is you get to meet your business heroes.
Oh, good.
But not only that, he narrated the foreword for me as well.
Oh,
and that's
cool.
Absolutely fantastic. So the audiobook will have Mike Bosworth. He's the author of Solution Selling, which is a classic sales book from the 1990s. So the book is available. You just need to type into your Google 7 Stories and you'll find it.
All right.
Oh, wow. And what's the most important message in the book?
The most important message is this, that you can pass all the information that you need to pass in your business conversations in the form of a story, and they'll be listened to and heard and accepted. And if you also ask back for the story from your client, you'll create business relationships that are a lot more fun and a lot more trusting and long lasting. And you'll do a lot better business as well. You do much bigger deals, you do better business, simply because you chose the communication style that our minds most naturally appreciate and love to use, which is stories.
God, that's beautiful.
I love stories, and I think you made it real personal today. I mean, you kind of took the subject and made it understandable. And I hope that, our listeners, got a lot out of this.
Yeah, and I understand you also have online training for story training.
I do. In fact, we coach down to the individual level with online training. We use video message. So we actually use WhatsApp. So you have the online training. You can get all the information about how to make your story, and then you can practice it, and then you can send us your stories in little 2-minute WhatsApp messages, and we'll listen to them, and then we'll give you some feedback. So we'll coach you. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, we'll coach you on your story, just using video message. It's an encrypted channel. It's a beautiful device.
Wow.
And the really nice thing about WhatsApp is when you send a video message, before you send it, you can review it. So you get a practice. So you listen to it and you say, well, I don't like it, so you do it again. So you actually get those repetitions to make it a habit to be able to remember your story and tell it well, which is exactly what you need to change conversation habits. You need opportunities for repetition. And so that video messaging turns out to be the perfect coaching tool for storytelling.
Absolutely.
All right.
So how do they get to that?
So they go to master.my7stories.com, and they'll see a training course for each of the 7 stories, and there's actually free version. In fact, there's an entire free online training course with the book, and many of the stories in the book, you can hear the people who are talked about in the book, you can hear them telling their stories in the online training as well, and that's actually all for free.
Yes.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yes.
Hey,
so the
free.
title of the book, again, is 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. You can just, I guess Mike said you could just type in 7 stories and
You'll find
there
it.
you go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Gosh, Mike, this has been fabulous. Thank you for being on the show.
Yes, thank you very much for being on the show. And I know it's early there.
Yeah.
No, that's okay. I turned my coffee machine on before I sat down.
All right, so
luckily it's a weekend. You can go back to sleep.
Yeah, you can go back to sleep or whatever, and or have another cup of coffee, something like that. There you go. But thank you for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Well, I hope I've inspired someone listening to just think a little bit differently about the stories they have, because every company has fantastic stories. You just need to know what they are and then go and find them, and then just practice telling them.
Well, I know if you're an inspiration, you've inspired us. So
Yeah, I'm going to tell stories
yeah,
now.
exactly. Anyway, everybody, thank you for listening to Mind the Business Radio. We had Mike Adams with us today telling 7 stories. And remember to go to Google and just type in 7 stories and you'll get right to his book.
There you are.
Yep. So, and we're going to say goodbye right now, and thank you for being here with us and listening to us, and we'll catch you next time right here on Minded Business Radio. Mind the Business Radio was produced in association with Taylor Pacific Video. Copyright 2018.